Hi, welcome back to my channel. I'm Celine, and today I would like to tell you a little bit about all of the books that I've been reading recently. Starting with the oldest book that I finished reading, this is The Vicar of Wakefield by Oliver Goldsmith, which was published in 1766, I think. So this is a pretty short comic novel. It's both comic and sentimental. It's got a little bit of melodrama mixed in and some like heightened emotions and all kind of stuff, but I think especially the beginning, when you start reading it, it's mostly a comic novel from the 18th century. And it has to be said that what people in the 18th century found funny is not necessarily funny to us. So the core of this story is a man and his family, and they do quite well in life at first, but due to a series of misfortunes, they sort of drop down the ladder in terms of how much money they have, but also in terms of respectability. Now, the reason that these misfortunes happen, some of them are just genuinely, unfortunate, just things that happen, but one of the cruxes in this book is just how naive some of the characters are. So they often get taken advantage of, and for example, once the son of this guy is taken advantage of by a swindler, and then the guy's like, oh, how could you do this? And then he goes in himself and also gets taken advantage of in pretty much exactly the same way. I also think this is a pretty good example of how historically writers had a tendency to not just write fiction, not just write the story, but sometimes just throw in their ideas about just anything, society, death. I think Goldsmith is quite interested in authority and tyranny. So sometimes the character might go onto a monologue about, the right of kings and how that works and a specific point of view on that. I would say that overall this is quite a readable, accessible book. I would say that the language is really not that hard to read for a 21st century perspective. And I think it helps that the story is quite focused generally just on one family. There's not a ton of characters that you need to keep track of. Apparently this book was quite popular in the Victorian era and people really loved it. I don't think it's a classic that has really stayed much in the public consciousness in the 21st century, but I do think it's definitely worth a read if you're interested in this period, or if you think any of the themes that I mentioned sound good to you, then I definitely recommend this one. Next up, I also read Recollections of Virginia Woolf by her contemporaries, which was collected by Joan Russell Noble. So this is exactly what it says on the tin, so there are a lot of recollections of Virginia Woolf by people who knew her. What I really enjoyed about this collection is that it's quite a wide range. So for example, we have the usual suspects. So for example, Vita Sackville-West, who will appear once more in this video later. For example, E.M. Forster, writers that she was associated with through, her network. But at the same time, it also contains some recollections, for example, of her cook, and also some people that basically barely knew her, that are just sharing a first impression or just like a view from afar, basically. I quite like a good gossip. I quite enjoy reading historical gossip about someone who has sadly passed away quite a long time ago. A lot of these stories reveal a lot about how people felt about Virginia Woolf, good and bad. So this is not just a polished eulogy of just how amazing she was. There are definitely some gripes that people had that are also included in this book. I think this is the kind of book that is mainly fun to read if you are quite obsessed with a certain historical person, in this case Virginia Woolf. I think, if you don't know anything about her, this is not the place to start really. But if you are familiar with Virginia Woolf and just a little bit of like the people in her life, you recognize the names in this collection, then I think this is great fun actually. With the caveat, of course, that Virginia Woolf unfortunately took her own life, so there is definitely a thread of grief, and particularly the section that was written by the cook who was in the house on the day that Virginia Woolf left and never came back. I think those sections are actually really affecting. So I would like to say that it's not all fun and games, but I think it's well written. I think some of the contributions are amazing. Some of the contributions are by people who I think in general aren't really writers. So it's very much a mixed bag. It's such an interesting kaleidoscope of people looking at one specific person, and as such, I thought this was great. Speaking of Vita Sackville-West, I also read All Passion Spent by the aforementioned. If, like me, you're sometimes perhaps bored, perhaps just a bit tired of reading about young protagonists all the time, you know, why is the average fiction protagonist like 23? If you would like to read a book about just a completely different age group, I think you might enjoy All Passion Spent, because this focuses on an elderly woman. Her husband has passed away. She has children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and she has reached almost the natural end point of her life, and she decides that it's time to focus on herself. This is quite a quiet literary book, so a lot of it is very introspective, which I think suits the life period that she's in. You know, her body is not great anymore. She's, I think, in her 80s. It's very much about a mental journey that she goes on. And one of the biggest themes is that she has basically dedicated her entire life to her family. She sacrificed a lot for all her children, for her husband. She always plays the role of the wife and of the mother. And she decides that in her old age, she's had enough, and now she's going to focus on herself. I found this story really powerful, even though it's one of those stories where nothing really happens outwardly, so there's not a huge plot. It's very much about her thoughts, it's very much about her reconsidering her life, reconsidering what she's done, and also a lot about regret, the fact that she chose a path that didn't leave a lot of space for her own wants and her own needs. And I think Sackville-West did an excellent job in exploring all of these things. It deals with some heavy themes, but at the same time, it's such a nice sort of flowing, almost kind of slice of life type story that I actually thought felt quite cozy in a way. Apparently a movie or a TV show was made out of this book, and that's definitely something I would be interested in watching. Speaking of more quiet stories, I also finished reading The Housekeeper and the Professor. This is a book that was very kindly gifted to me. If you'd like to see all the books that I got for my birthday, I did a book haul for my 30th birthday, and this was one of the books that I got. So this is about a professor who has had a car accident and his memory has gotten affected, and he is no longer able to remember more than, I think, was it 80 minutes? Yes, 80 minutes. And this is about his housekeeper, and also about the housekeeper's son, who is affectionately nicknamed Root because his head is like the shape of a square root. And it's a story about memory, it's a story about kindness, and also about what does friendship mean if someone can't remember you? How do we make connections with people? There's so much in this quiet little novel, and tying it all together is a love for numbers, a love for mathematics. Now I have to admit, I do actually quite like numbers and maths and physics and stuff like that, but I didn't quite connect with the math portion of this story. I think a lot of it was, it's very hard to explain, it's like an almost abstract love for numbers as themselves. So almost reflecting on the feeling that certain numbers have and their mathematical properties and stuff like that. And I think I am just someone who is more interested in the practical aspect of maths, so perhaps applied mathematics. I have always enjoyed the puzzle aspect of math and STEM subjects. And this book has quite a different view on math, and the housekeeper and her son connect to the professor through math, which I thought was wonderful, and it's so lovely to read. But I do think this book didn't quite hit that, you know, that real sweet spot where you're just completely immersed in a book. I think it didn't quite hit that because and I didn't quite connect to it just as amazingly as I thought I would, but I very much enjoyed this, and I definitely see why this is a book that has become quite popular. Next up, I read a book that would have been fantastic for my medieval women video, but sadly I didn't have the book yet when I made that video, and that is Christine the Pizan, which is Life, Work, Legacy, written by Charlotte Cooper Davies. Christine the Pizan was a writer who lived in the 14th century, and she lived most of her life in France. I think she was born in Venice, but she mainly lived in France, particularly in Paris. And she was exceptionally active as a writer, but also as like a producer of books, because you have to remember that in this time books were handwritten because the printing press hadn't been invented yet. And this book makes a compelling case for the fact that Christine probably oversaw the production of her books quite closely, and that she was quite knowledgeable about the production aspect of books, in addition to, of course, writing them, which she also did in quite a large quantity. And luckily, because Christine and luckily because she made quite a lot of manuscripts of her books, we have a lot of them. We relatively have quite a good collection of them remaining to us in archives. So the book that she's most popular for, and the book that I think is most read by people, is The Book of the City of Ladies, which is this sort of utopian vision, I guess, of a city of women. And I haven't read that book yet, but I would very much like to. The aim of this book is for it to be addressed to a wide audience, so although the writer is an academic, it's not a book that goes like too academic-y. So it takes its time telling you how the book trade actually worked during this time and what role Christine the Pizan played in that. One of the best things about this edition is that it has a ton of pictures, and one of my favourite things about medieval manuscripts, and I know this is slightly silly, but I love looking at the illuminations, I love looking at all the little drawings and pretty swirls and all of the decoration that happens on a medieval manuscript, and that is something that the modern book doesn't really have. You know, most modern books are literally just text, and I think in the medieval time, because it was such an object that sometimes took years to make, that it became an object of art within itself. I think that's something that is really cool, and sort of the material conditions of the book trade is very much a theme of this book. So I'm very glad that they chose to actually include a lot of images, so when they're talking about certain illuminations or, you know, specific manuscripts, more often than not, you will be able to actually look at the picture. This book was really successful, I think, in making me feel like I learned a lot more about Christine the Pizan, because she was not a figure that I knew a lot about, without bogging me down with too many details that I didn't understand without any additional context. I think it was very good at presenting the context in a clear manner, and although the author certainly had a bit of a bone to pick with certain aspects of the legacy of Christine the Pizan, specifically perhaps projecting ideologies, contemporary ideologies, onto a person who would not have been familiar with those ideas whatsoever. And I can certainly understand where Cooper Davies was coming from. I'm not sure I completely agree with her assessment and her reading of the legacy of Christine the Pizan, but that certainly doesn't detract from this book. And I think it was really fun and really fascinating, and, you know, if I could make an addendum to my medieval women video, I would add this book. The next book I read was a book that I started in my try a couple of fantasy books for my shelves video that I posted a little while ago, and that is Temeraire by Naomi Novik. So in that video, I tried the first chapter. I'm not even sure I even finished the first chapter, but I read a couple of pages of this book and really enjoyed it, and decided that I definitely wanted to keep this book. Sorry, spoiler alert for that video, I guess. So I decided to just keep reading it, and this was really fun. Let me paint you a picture of the opening scene. You know, there's been a sea battle. Think Napoleonic Wars, that's what this world is very much based on. The English have conquered the French, but there is something in their ship, and it's a dragon egg. So the captain of the English ship is like, oh dear, it's a dragon egg. We gotta get it to the mainland, but they don't quite make it to the mainland. The dragon hatches and attaches to the captain of the ship. Now in this world, dragon riders are very much separate from other parts of society. So the captain, who was of course part of the navy, can no longer stay in the navy. You know, he has to leave. He has to become a dragon person now. And I think Novik is really good at taking those very classic fantasy tropes. You know, learning to become a dragon rider is a thing that happens in dozens, if not hundreds, of fantasy books. But she's a very skilled writer, and I think she does a great job in making this feel, you know, fun, engaging. I like that this wasn't a super long fantasy book. One of my gripes with fantasy is that it often takes way too long for anything of any interest to happen. One of the strengths of the book is definitely the connection between the dragon and the main character. I don't know, there's just something so fun about having a conversation with a dragon, and it's something that I think pretty much always amuses me whenever it is used in a fantasy book. For me, a part that was slightly less successful was when we get to the action, because, you know, it's in Napoleonic Wars, some battles must be had. I didn't love the description of the battles. I found myself just kind of drifting off in thought when all of these tactics are being explained, and I have to admit that I am only interested in action scenes from the perspective of a character that I care about. I very much don't particularly care about war tactics at all. So I would say that the climax of this book was perhaps not as successful or as amusing for me as the rest of the book was. I wouldn't consider that particularly Novik's fault. I think that very much has to do with me. I don't particularly love military fantasy, so that is definitely on me and not on this book. If I feel like having more cozy historical fantasy shenanigans, then I'll pick up the next book in this series. It's not a series that I'm in any particular rush to read all, however many are in that series, all in one go. Then another fantasy book I read was The Jasmine Throne by Tasha Suri, and this is quite a big book, so I'm going to put it behind me rather than holding this up the whole time. Although this book is definitely heavy and like physically large, I definitely do think it's quite a quick read, so I didn't feel like it took me too long to get through this book. It's the first in a trilogy, and the second book is already out, and it's somewhere up there. I think you can just see it, is this one. The third book I think is coming out in November, and the theme of this book is very much around tyranny as well as revolution. So there are two main characters. One of them is the sister to the Emperor. The Emperor is a tyrant. He is cruel. He gives me a little bit of like Nero vibes, you know, he just likes seeing stuff burn. And he has tried to have her put to death. She has refused, you know, there's some ritual aspects to this. And he's basically trying to get her to die through slightly slower means. So she's in prison, etc. Then there is another main character who was part of a religious group, and that religious group had certain magical capabilities. However, all of them were killed except for her and someone else that she knows. And through various plot reasons, these two characters meet, and it is the spark of something bigger. There is a group who is trying to start a revolution. There's a lot of discussion about what means are excusable within starting a revolution. You know, how many deaths are justified for a cause that's seen as just. I think one of the best things about this book is that it takes something that, again, is quite common in fantasy, the revolutionary overthrowing of an evil government, especially ever since the Hunger Games. I feel like that is such a massive trope in speculative fiction, but I often feel like the way it's portrayed is way too simplistic. We know from history that when a revolution happens, it doesn't stop at that point. You know, after the French Revolution, it wasn't like they just magically went into democracy within 2 years. The journey that France as a republic had involved massive wars, civil war, it involved Napoleon. You know, it really wasn't that simple. The historical reality was a lot more complex than that, and it also took a lot longer than people might realize. So I really appreciated that Suri as an author takes a lot more nuanced of a view towards tyranny, revolution, and all of the people that get stuck between different factions. This is not a world where there are easy answers, and one of the things that complicates the easy answers is, for example, that family members might be on opposite ends of factions, which of course creates really complicated relationships. And yeah, I think this was a really interesting book. I really enjoyed it. It felt like quite a quick read, you know, the pages turned pretty quickly. There were quite some compelling horror components to it, so there's this type of, perhaps a plague, where people are slowly turning into plants, so they'll have like pieces of plant like bursting from their veins, and it's all quite gruesome. So perhaps a little warning, if you're very squeamish, then this might not be the book for you. I look forward to reading the other two books in this trilogy, and I also really quite like the covers, so I'm quite happy to have the nice hardcovers for my own collection. So those were all the books that I read recently. I hope you enjoyed this video. Let me know if you read any of these books, if you enjoyed them. If you didn't enjoy them, you know, also fair enough. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you again soon. Bye!